All right. Welcome, welcome. We are in part 2 of our National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Children, Youth, and Families School-Based Services Policy Learning Forum. My name is Leora. We are just getting started and folks are coming in. So we're grateful to have you during this session. We're grateful if you're listening wherever you are in life and in the world. Thereafter the session, these conversations are meant to be recorded so that we can continue the rich learning. Again, welcome, Leora. It's 3 p.m. here in California, and I hope it is earlier or at the same time wherever you are. So you're not having us as a dinner date, but if you are, we're honored. Again, this is part 2. So if you are in the room, you are here to be part of a learning, listening space to really incredible school mental health champions who I have personally and professionally got to learn and grown so much with. So again, welcome. If you're just joining us, if you can please put your name and your role and one thing that you're hoping to learn or one thing that brings you to this session into the chat box. Your name and your role and one thing you're hoping to learn from this conversation. And with that said, Carrie, we're going to move ahead because we've got rich learning and some good intro slides to go through. I want to offer us again, welcome to this conversation. Everything that is said and offered and discussed in this session is of our own opinions and our opinions only. We're grateful for funding from SAMHSA, and the views and opinions expressed in this session do not necessarily reflect those of SAMHSA. If you are on the Zoomie, there are going to be slides up at the beginning, and those are just for us to frame. So what I like to do is I like to go to view and I like to click on side-by-side speakers so I can see the speakers on the right-hand side and the PowerPoint on the left-hand side. We're going to offer and invite a very strong invitation for everyone to be muted. That is, of course, unless you are a peer teacher and you are speaking, that everyone can be muted so that we can center the learning. They are going to be recorded. So you'll get all the recordings from the previous session, this session, Thursday sessions, and then we're going to be tracking the learning in a kind of guided capture tool for you afterwards. So really grateful for that to be accessible. And speaking of accessibility, we do have closed captioning thanks to Zoom. So you can click on that live transcript and you'll be able to follow along if that helps you feel connected and to be able to track sometimes fast speakers like myself. I'm going to try and remind myself to take a breath so that I'm not a fast speaker. You can also always click reactions because we are a Zoom meeting. So if you see something that Amber or Kendall or Monica, Rochelle or Yasmina say that make you feel extra lit up or affirmed or seen or curious, feel free to let us know in that way. Okay, we will most likely and hopefully have a space at the very end to raise our hands for questions. You can always, of course, again, click on reactions and click on that raised hand icon, and that will bring you right up to the front. And then we'll be able to hear what's going on in your mind. I want to just offer that even though these folks are spotlit, every single person in this room, I'm looking at all the people in the room who I know so well, and those I'm just getting to know, you have great fountains of wisdom. And so if at any point in time you have resources, ideas, comments, please put them in the chat box so we can learn with you. Okay. Let's move from that incredibly dynamic slide about Zoom. Okay, so just a very, very, very quick introduction to the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Children, Youth, and Families. If you're new to NTAC, we are a beautiful multidisciplinary team of incredible intersectional, interdisciplinary, intra-developmental team members and agencies across the country. We are funded to support the systems of care approach to support children, youth, and families as a collective and united holistic ecosystem. So we've got partners who specialize in family partnership, youth partnership, equity, youth early childhood development, infant and early childhood development. Yasmin and I are on the school-based services team. So that is why we are here to talk about school-based services, but we are part of a large constellation across the pipeline of folks who are funded to support you to do the transformational work that you are funded to do. So on that note, I want to take a brief pause. We're so happy to have you. Thank you for being here. Okay, Carrie, let's shift. Okay. So we already are doing this. If you've not done this yet, please put your name and your role and what brings you. You can either one person you can dedicate your learning to. That was my prompt that came to me whenever we did these slides, but actually really I'm interested in what you're hoping to hear. So we have someone who's hoping to hear about, not someone, Rebecca Sorgo is hoping to hear about panelists, about sustainability, about promoting school-based mental health and strategies. I'm scrolling up so I can learn how to partner with educators and family members and caregivers for policy crafting. So lots of good stuff. We're a small group. I'm going to launch a poll. Sorry, Carrie, one moment. We're a small group, but I'm okay, I'm unmuting myself. I'm going to launch a poll right now so that we can learn about who is in the room. So you should have a poll that's in front of you. And we've got questions if you are part of the Advancing Wellness and Resilience in Education cohort, what your level of policy is, and also if you attended our April policy primer that Yasmina, myself, Matt, Christy, and a whole bunch of other folks put together. Oh, someone did. 2 people did. That's so exciting. So if you can take a moment to answer the poll, and I will share it when I have it. And we can find out more about what is bringing us into this space. Okay, a couple more folks. All right, I'm gonna end the poll and share the results. So the really lovely news is that we've got some folks who were part of the original AWARE cohort in 2014, 2018, 2019, and 2020. So 4 years of systems level school mental health championship in the house. And we also have a good amount of folks who are doing other school mental health work. Maybe your restorative justice folks, your systems of care folks, your safe and supportive school folks. So we're so welcome to have you. And we do have the majority of you identify as beginner intermediate, which by the way, I'm in that group. Here to listen to folks who might consider themselves advanced or themselves beginner intermediate. And the other piece about policy and level of comfort, again, as I said at the very beginning, is that we are all learners in this incredibly complex art of school mental health policy design and creation, and then on Thursday, implementation. So we are all lifelong learners, and so glad to see that some of you identify as folks with a little bit more know-how, because that might mean that you can chime in the chat box and help us enrich the learning. So I'm going to stop sharing that and let's continue our opening. Welcome, Lisa. Okay, just taking a moment here. I personally always need this, whether I'm moderating or whether I am listening, because so much of our days and our hours are blocked off by 50-minute, 90-minute, 45-minute calendar invites. I just want to take a quiet moment to just feel your feet on the ground, feel your body, like, oh yeah, here I am, body, here's my shoulders, literally, like, here I am. Here we are on the 24th. Maybe we're coming from a summer that gave us a little bit more breath. Maybe we're coming from a summer that did not. Maybe we're entering a fall that feels spacious. Maybe we're entering a fall that feels like a lot of to-dos that we don't know necessarily how to tackle. Just want to acknowledge all the different moments that we're in and all the different funds of knowledge and funds of well-being that we enter the conversation with. But most importantly, acknowledge that we're here right now. So as much as you can do for yourself, including myself, if you're listening to this recording or if you're in the conversation, the question might be, what is one thing that you can do to, right, to narrow in on who you are and why you're in this particular conversation, because we have so many choices about what we do with our time. And we're so glad that you're doing this with us. Okay. Movement, going forth. Thank you. Okay, so hopefully you feel welcome and grounded. Yasmina and I are gonna provide a little bit of foundation, because we do have some beginners. And so we want in a trauma-informed way to level set, to do some shared language building. And then we get to shift our conversation to Kendall, to Yasmina, to Rochelle, to Monica, and to Amber, and to listen to our peer teachers. They're not experts, they're not professors up, although someone might be soon. But we say peer teachers really because we want to level that there is really that collaboration and mutuality in this conversation. All right, all that to say, let's lay some foundation. Okay, so we are here in part one to move back the attention from the what, from the concrete policy. I was going to try and hold up a book, but I actually don't have one on my desk right now. But the concrete policy, this is a concrete policy, to the actual ways in which policy has been designed, is designed, and who benefits from policies, who is harmed from policies, and how do we engage as courageous school mental health champions? How do we engage in difficult and brave conversation to examine the way in which policies can either be a lever of humanization or dehumanization, both in the past, now, and in the future. On Thursday, if you're someone who's more of a tell me what to do in the tangibles, join us back on Thursday, and Yasmina will be moderating a really rich two-parter again on the how, the what and the how and the where and the checklist. No, there's also still not a checklist, but there we are. Okay, so we're here now for foundations. Let's get into that. Okay. If you were with us in April, this may sound familiar, but this is Yasmina and my it's abouts. It's abouts. So as we're reading the it's abouts, I'm inviting you, if you're listening to this, if you are with us on screen, to feel in your body as a leader, which it's about makes you go, and which it's about makes you go, and which it's about makes you go, Meaning, what do you agree with? What do you aspire to? And what might you argue with? Because those are important in reflection questions for our leadership practice. So I'm going to start the first. This whole thing, why school mental health policy? Why? The first and primary pillar of our Yasmina and Leora's it's about is that it's fundamentally about health, not just school mental, but about the whole human body. We could even argue environmental body of health. This holistic approach that we are intra-connected human beings. So a policy on curriculum instruction, a policy on discipline, a policy on special ed, a policy that seems like it is separate is actually a school mental health policy, because it's about the whole human, not about the division in the system that it appears through. So it is ultimately about health, and we're doing this work to look at our policies, examine them, and design them for the purposes of living, not just being alive.
And I think that leads in really well to the next what's about, because it's about anti-racism, taking it a step beyond being about equity and taking it to the language we're using is anti-racism being an action, meaning we are no longer neutral. And especially in education, has been the system and the tool of inequity and oppression, particularly at the state level. And so when we take on school mental health policy, everything from the books we read to the authors on the approved reading list all has an impact on what our students have access to, the voices that they're exposed to, and their overall wellness. And that's about anti-racism.
That's right. Thank you. Trauma policies are not neutral. They are all relics of bias, right? Positive and negative. It's also about sustainability. So I'm speaking hopefully a love language to those of you in the room that without talking about policies, the championship that many of us do as individuals won't live on. And so part of this work is to think about what policies need to be sustained and what policies have been sustained that should not have been sustained. So it's a both and.
Along with both and, we talk about accountability and safety, and a lot of times folks don't connect safety to mental health policy, but part of our work is to change the conversation that safety is more than fences and walls and bulletproof glass, and safety is about connection and relationship and the meaningful community that's created on a campus. And when we talk about accountability as it relates to policy, our actions in undoing harmful policy can generate as much action as drafting something from scratch. So it's little actions that can create the biggest change.
Yeah. Our fifth it's about is making the implicit commitments explicit. That oftentimes we can say, I believe in this, and having policy both in the way that we have organized for policy and then when it is actually on paper, that when we make the implicit explicit, we are naming what we are willing to be held accountable for and to and by. And so part of the work, especially around creating trauma-informed anti-racist policies, especially for school mental health, is again, moving maybe what is not talked about into the forefront and being incredibly explicit so that we can either hold it up or take it down.
And when we think about the last thing, it's about our organization and our own self-care as an organization. But I would like to ask us to think about the community care, the organizational community care as an ecosystem. And when we think about all the other things that lead up to school mental health policy, but especially our commitments to anti-racism and sustainability, like how are we with our own internal organization reflecting the values in our own policies, in our own practices, in our own procedures that we are then asking the folks within our care or under our purview or in our classrooms, and how are we living it and caring for each other?
That's right. So what does that mean? That also means that, for example, if we're living into that last it's about, it means that bereavement policy, it means that family leave policy, it means that HR, those are all school mental health policies.
It means that you look at who you're hiring and do they reflect the kids in your classroom? It means what languages do they speak? And is that reflective of the community you serve? And your school administrators especially,
yep.
They can make
yep. And attendance, Monica's adding attendance. Yeah, Monica, we're gonna put that on the slate for the conversation. Let's unpack attendance policies. Okay. So, and by the way, that phrase, and that's part of what this conversation is. So what I get excited about is even the phrase school discipline or attendance is actually speaking to that making implicit commitments explicit, because oftentimes attendance policies are actually just coded for policing Black and brown student bodies and where they are and getting funded for their body's presence, not actually about their learning, right? So we want to get really, really clear about when we're making a policy, what language are we using, truancy, what language are we using that actually is speaking to the need and not the behavior. So all that to say, by the end of all of those it's abouts, I want to invite us to just have a moment in the chat box to reflect which it's about were you like lit up about. Yes, I'm co-sign me, I'm gonna want to be president of the It's About Anti-Racism coalition, right? And or do you have another it's about that brings you to this conversation that we did not mention? So I see we had folks, yeah, Amy's like, it's about accountability and safety. Yes. Yes. All right, good. We have self-nominated regalness for it's about kids, Kendall. It's about kids. It's about organizational self-care. It's about health. It's about transparency. It's about connection. It's about sustainability. It's about organizational self-care. It's about health. Gorgeous. It's about making implicit commitments, explicit. Yeah, nice. Okay. We're going to add some of your it's abouts. I love that. Okay. Are you, I'm feeling, this is our second one. Yasmin and I had the first round earlier, and that was also incredibly juicy juice. And this is going to be incredibly juicy. So I'm feeling good. All right, let's move ahead. Because what we want to do before we open the conversation is, again, level set. And there are many of you, Lisa, in the conversation, others of you who have heard this before, but that's because it's about that the policy is the outcome, but the actual work is, again, being really intentional about what does that policy reflect of the values and the belief systems of the community that it is supposed to serve. And what are the cultural and situational contexts that get us to that policy being able to come alive? And I'm going to take a moment because I'm looking at the names in this room. There are many of us whose work was funded and whose purpose and why came to be because there was a loss, there was an experience of violence, there was a violation, there was a harm that happened. That was the context. Right? If you're a Project Aware grantee, it's because young people were killed due to gun violence in Newtown. It doesn't mean that many of us who have been school mental health champions for a very long time hadn't been doing that work. It just means that there are sometimes windows, cultural contexts that open the door for our work to be able to actuate, right? And so I want to hold that sometimes we forget in our championship, sometimes I forget, I'm not going to assume that you do, that our championship rests upon a lot of work of some folks who never saw the fruits of that organizing labor, and on experiences of deep harm that folks want to say no more, no more, no more. And we're called into that. So when we're talking about designing policy in this conversation, Kendall, Yasmina, Amber, Monica, and Rochelle, the actual, for me as moderator, what we are hoping that we talk about the most are the values and belief systems and the cultural and situational contexts that lead us and have led us to the policies that we're either trying to continue or trying to curb.
So as we move forward and we talk about what does policy look like, and as Leora shared, really those cultural contexts, those belief systems inform our why. And I like to think of a policy as our programs and practices, what we do and for whom we do it. So there's different types of policy. And so what my biggest hope that the takeaway to everyone here is that you all have the ability to impact some type of policy. It's just about figuring out where is your sphere of influence. We might not all be a legislator someday and get to craft and draft legislation that regulates our laws and our codes. We might never sit on a school board that creates and drafts regulations for our state or for our district, but we all can impact policy. Educators have classroom policies, schools have school policies. I have a personal policy that if it's your third marriage, you only get a card. That's a personal policy. We have policy at every sphere of our influence.
But remind everyone of the disclaimer that I said at the very top. All views and opinions expressed are of the presenters only. Okay, yes. But the point is, I think the point is that we talk a lot about that sometimes policy, especially if those of us who are beginners, can seem really overwhelming, can feel like, oh, I have to create an entire statewide legislation regulation about the thing. And there are so many policies that we enact either consciously or unconsciously, create consciously or unconsciously, that we have deep, deep levels of influence, control, and responsibility for. So speaking of that, I am so incredibly thrilled, jazzed, juiced, excited, interested, curious, insert other whatever kind of grammar I'm using right now, about the about folks who are in this room. Amber, Kendall, Monica, Rochelle, and Yasmina. I'm going to invite Carrie to take down the PowerPoint, because who needs PowerPoint? And we're going to center and liberate ourselves in our Zoom boxes. And I'm going to invite, and I'm putting the order in the chat box, I'm going to invite Amber, Kendall, Monica, Rochelle, and Yasmina to go do a go around with names, pronouns, role, and what is your connection to the work of school-based services health policy. You can share your professional connection, you can share your family connection, you can share your personal why, your choice. So we'll start with Amber.
Thank you, Leora. I'm so excited to be here. I can't even tell you how I woke up this morning. I was like, it's policy day, for so many reasons for me. So my name is Amber Reed. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And my role, I'm with the Nevada Department of Education in the Office for a Safe and Respectful Learning Environment. And I do a lot of our policy work at the department around school mental health. I get to write, legislation and regulations, which makes me super excited. And I know my master's degree tells me that also makes me diagnosable. So I have an undergrad in education, a master's in social work, and I'm this close to that PhD in political science. So I'm very excited to be here, and I will pass it on to Kendall.
Hi there, my name is Kendall Fujioka. I use she, her pronouns. I joined Project Aware with ABC Unified School District in Los Angeles County. The first year of their grant, 2014, was my first year as an MSW intern. I had the opportunity to grow with that program. And thankfully, by year 5, I was the project director for that final year of CalWell, and was then able to meet Ms. Monica Nepomuceno and the California Department of Education. And I was there as a district administrator, and unfortunately, doing all of this work, and then there was this parent of a foster child who threatened to sue us. And I was like, yeah, they probably should. And at that point, I felt like maybe I wasn't on the right side of where I wanted to be. I didn't feel that I had the capacity to make the change that I wanted to, even if I was changing the foster youth enrollment policies. And I ended up applying to law school. So I have just completed my first year of law school at the University of Washington. I was at my internship this summer. I was with the Federal Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, super cool. And thank you to Leora hooking me up with Kelsey Schmitz. This fall, I will be starting as a research consultant for the policy work of the UW Smart Center, School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training. So I'm super excited to be here. And I don't remember who's next after me. I believe Monica.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Leora, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. My name is Monica Nepomuceno. I'm with the California Department of Education, where I'm an education programs consultant, and I work on mental health and suicide prevention activities and projects throughout the state. And my connection to mental health and mental health policy is I live with anxiety, and it gets pretty severe sometimes. And I just realized actually just a couple of years ago when I was in my 30s, that I had been living with anxiety. I didn't know for all these years what I felt and what my body felt and what my mind felt was all it had a name, and it was anxiety. And so I think that led me on a path to, unbeknownst to me or subconsciously, I selected the world of social work to go into. And so I've been on that quest for a while now. I did work in an elementary school for over 12 years, helping connect students to behavioral health services and health, just physical health services, and advocating for them. And just like you, Kendall, sometimes I felt like I wasn't on the right side of the equation. And so there was a point in my elementary school level career working with elementary school students, and that I realized I think I need to shift, because I felt like, being an empath and experiencing anxiety, I was feeling a lot of what the students were feeling, and I had to like remove myself for my own mental wellness, right? So then I had an opportunity to come to the state level, and I never in a million years thought that I would be working on policy. If somebody would have told me that, I would have been like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I don't know enough about it. But interestingly enough, this is where I landed, and I've been chairing the student mental health policy work group since 2012. So we're going on 10 years. We're experiencing a little hiatus right now. But it's all part of the growing and carrying the momentum, and I'm not letting it drop. We're just experiencing a hiatus, and at some point we're going to reconvene and impact policy again. So I'm happy to be with all of you here today. Thank you. I'll pass it over to who is
Rochelle.
And then
Thank
Yasmina.
you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rochelle Espiritu. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a co-founder and managing partner of Change Matrix, which is a partner on NTAC. I went into the field of psychology when I lost a dear friend of mine to suicide, who was Filipina. I'm also a Filipina immigrant, first generation. And it just highlighted for me the stigma that the community has in terms of identifying mental health challenges as well as seeking help for it. And so as I worked in the field of psychology and then also became a TA provider and providing support to many systems leaders across the nation, and was a TA provider for the Project Aware first cohort of grantees, just continuously saw that mental health was not a player in school systems often. So this opportunity came up for me to serve on the school board for Denver Public Schools. And I was like, yeah, you know what? We need that here. We need the focus on whole child and on mental health. And so I stepped into a policy role that was one of the most challenging leadership positions that I've ever held, and the most rewarding as well. So I drank from the fire hose for a while, learning about school policy and districts and getting to serve on the inside of an inner circle, but also keeping deep, close ties to community that were really helpful for me. So I'm excited to share some of those experiences with you all today. And I will pass it over to Yasmina.
Rochelle, I think I am forever going to describe my initiation to policy as drinking from a fire hose, because that is definitely what it felt like. And I'm also going to take a cue from all of the panelists and enter brave space today and tell you, instead of the regular resume rundown, that the reason I went into mental health is because I'm a gun violence survivor. I lost a parent to gun violence as a child. And I'm a child of an immigrant. And I think those two things really influenced, well, not my dog to bark at the door right now, but really influenced my desire to do this work and to serve this field. And the folks responsible for that crime were considered children by the system of law, which in my mind, as an adult who knows how neurodevelopment works, it's one of the most heartbreaking things for me. So that is why I do this work, so that more children don't have that experience on both ends, juvenile justice and children without parents. But and I'll let you just take it from there. I'm sure everyone read my little byline on registration.
Thanks, Yasmina. And we get to thank you, Yasmina. I think we get to the benefit of you, who is normally in my role now of intro and and we get to actually learn from the wealth of experience that you bring. So, okay, breath. So much already. I want to open it, and just for the folks who are listening and who are on with us right now, there is a norm of vibrant discourse, meaning there may be questions that go to some folks, but I have invited folks to chime in, to add on, to layer. So just in case, and this is real actually, you get a little anxious seeing people potentially breaking norms. They're not, because this is part of it. That's what we're supposed to be doing. All right, speaking of which, we are from 70 million different types of training. There are folks in the room who have 70 million different types of roles. Let's talk about when we say even the word policy, what language should we be using in different spheres to organize different roles to do the same thing? So that's a kind of open invitation, first to Amber, then to Rochelle, to give us a little bit of like, yeah, when we're actually talking about policy with families, I might use this language, or policy in school board. This is what helps folks get on board. It's also an invitation for you to agree or argue with anything Yasmin and I opened with when we define policy. So going to you first, Amber.
Thanks, Leora. I think that I had told Leora and Yasmin I could talk about policy for like days without taking a breath, probably. So I think one of the things that in thinking about today's session and so many good thoughts that were running through my brain as you were going through the intro slides, and I think that oftentimes we think about policy as value statements, right? You referenced beliefs. And in the world of political science, we would say public policy is fundamentally who gets what, when, and how. That would come from Harold Laswell. Thinking about some of the whys, that we are accountable to what we say that we believe, that we will walk our talk, and that we're explicit and intentional in formalizing those things. And there's policy theory and there's policy reality, and they don't always interact super cleanly. And so I think that sometimes when we hear the word policy, depending on our current roles or our perspectives, our experiences, we're gonna have a different sort of response. I think for some people, policy, you say policy to me and it's like, Christmas morning, right? It may be my favorite thing, second to possibly data. But for a lot of people, that could be, really panic inducing as well, right? Or it could be really a scary or overwhelming thing to think about. And so I think that it's important to sort of bound policy to say it's a really broad and general term that can be formal or informal. We can talk about codified or formalized policies, and we can also talk about those sort of norms and rules and what we might call institutions, the ways that we interact with each other in shared understanding, and it bridges the gap between micro to macro, right? So we can have ground level. Yasmina mentioned a personal policy, which made me giggle, right? On third marriage, you really don't need another set of hands, probably. But that's a personal policy, right? All the way up to federal policies or international policies. And so as a term, I would say, to think about it in terms of your own role, your current role and your sphere of influence. And I think the other thing that's important for me to recognize that Leora referenced earlier is that sort of the interconnectedness and the interdependence of it. When as a practitioner, right, as a school social worker, and a lot of my colleagues in school social work said, I'm going to be a micro level, I'm going to be a clinician. And I don't really want to think about or talk about macro level work or policy work, advocacy. How many times have you been sitting in a room with a student or a family, and you are trying to navigate a very real barrier that is the function of a policy, right? Whether it was helping them qualify for TANF or food stamps or meeting graduation requirements. I had a student that the very next day, that policy was going away, and he was a fifth-year senior with full custody of his child. And the next day, right? And I was like, I just want to get this kid across the stage. So failure to sort of recognize, I think, the interdependence and the way that all of those sort of layers of policy interact with each other is limiting in terms of our ability to influence those and to think about where our sphere of influence starts and ends and what we're able to do And I think for me, it's, do what you can, start where you're at, and make your difference in your own sphere.
Thanks, Amber. I'm curious, Rochelle, what comes up for you, and cueing Monica too, of like how, again, this conversation that can seem really large, how do you as organizers find language to get folks to see their accountability and role and benefit in school mental health policy work?
Yeah, thanks, Amber. I appreciated that, all those different ways of thinking about it. And I think that one of the things that I learned as a school board member is that, yes, the term policy can feel very overwhelming, especially for family members, community members, and students. And so I think about how they can be statements about who we're choosing to be, who we're choosing to serve, and the principles that are going to kind of guide that. And so in the most simple language for students, it's about the rules, right? It's about the rules that we have to follow. And all of us have rules. They're sometimes implicit and sometimes they're explicitly stated. And that we're kind of governed by them in some ways. And yet there are also ways to work around them, and that they can have unintended impacts. And I think that is one of the things that I'm always looking at, or was always looking at while I was on school board, are, they're set out to be a certain outcomes that you're hoping to achieve from those policies. And yet there's always going to be some kind of unintended impact that occurs because of the rule, the way it's stated or the way it's implemented. And so I love the idea too about thinking about it at a macro and a micro to macro level, because I think that gives everyone a sense of voice and purpose in this space, because everyone does. And when you don't use your voice, you're kind of giving up the power that you have in this kind of process. And I think that is the harm that often happens for students, for family members, and for adults in school buildings, is when they don't realize they have voice, you're giving away your power. And so people in positions of power, either formal or informal, who hold specific roles, they are people, and there are opportunities to make those connections. And so I think that's one thing hopefully we'll talk about a little bit later on too, is that policies are about people. We can't forget that. We always have to keep students first in this work. And so that's what always drove me as I served on the board. I'll pass it over to Monica.
Can I just say super quickly, you had policy as an outcome, and I think policy is also a process. And I think what Rochelle just talked about was absolutely about policy as process and bringing in voice.
Yeah, Rochelle, you touched on a lot of the points that I was thinking about too. Immediately when I think of policy, I think about rules, but I also think that rules don't, they're not equal for everybody. And some rules we have to undo so that they can be equitable and fair to all. And so just, honestly, when I'm looking and reflecting on my whole journey here, in working at a school first, I was one of those people that were naively thinking, not necessarily that I'd give my power away, because I'm not necessarily that kind of person, but when you're considering the macro level, right, it's much easier, I think, in people's minds to say, I want to help people directly, and I don't want to deal with all of this other stuff, all the political things, and that is a part of being like a young social worker, naive about just thinking, I'm going to influence, this is my sphere of influence, and that's what I can do, without really making that connection of what you just said. If you're helping a student, then you have to work within the systems who have policies. And so we have to think that there's, again, personal policies, there's policies at the local level. And sometimes they fit well, and sometimes they don't. And so we have to, from our roles, we have to look at those that are not working well, or maybe nobody's even thought of a policy, right? So bringing together those masterminds and thought partners to help think how things could be made smoother, how things could be improved for all people involved. And then also, I just think that it's really important, like that whole transparency factor, right? You can't do things. There's a saying in Spanish that says, no hagas cosas buenas que parezcan malas. Don't do good things that look like bad things. And so a lot of times when people are behind closed doors and there's all this hush hush and they're not transparent about really what they want to achieve or how they want to achieve it, then that seems like they're working against the people.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's such a good cue. That's such a good cue into talking about exactly what Amber, Rochelle, where you have been lifting up already, which is getting into the process. What are examples that have worked for you, with you in your vision of justice, that have worked when partnering with students and families and educators in designing policy or examining? And what are the like, woo, do not, that was a bad move. I really messed that one up. So wanting to get into the like humility of even designing, because it's not an easy thing to partner, especially when there are many of you who work in state systems where the sense of urgency is vibrant, right? Get it done now. May not be the right sense of urgency, but there is that sense of urgency. So wanting Yasmina, everyone, actually, this whole crew, how do we do this co-designing from a trauma-informed lens, student-centered, educator-centered, family-centered policy with students, with educators, and with families? Examples, please tell us.
I'll jump in. A lot of what I found was having student stories connected with the grown-ups. Fundraising for the holidays, when you can give them the ornament from the 9-year-old homeless student that they're helping and things like that, where it tugs at their feelings. One of the populations that was often neglected for me was our continuation high school students. So informally, some of the policies that I kind of went rogue and did a student attendance survey and asked, your primary reasons for not coming to school. Is it a transportation issue? Is it a family care issue? Is it a clothing and shoes issue? And like 50% of the students, it was a mental health issue. The other one being a bus transportation issue. The bus transportation issue was that the bus drivers didn't have a policy to actually, if they made it to their stop on time, they don't have to wait around for students who are running down the block, which means the continuations, high school students who are running down the block, then that's an unexcused absence, that they're not going to make it. The other one being the mental health issues, then I try to advocate, let's get you guys another mental health therapist, and the ASB students are on board, and the student Peace Club is all on board, and it comes down to, who's actually making those decisions. But when the students show up in front of the school board, that carries a little bit more weight with it than someone who's out of touch just making these recommendations.
I put in the chat, and I'll just add really quickly, I think that you need the qualitative with the quantitative, right? The data oftentimes, oftentimes our decision makers do need the data. They really do. And it also, you need to also speak to, if you've read Jonathan Haidt's work at all, the elephant and not just the writer, the heart, right? The heart is what makes the decisions before the brain makes the decisions. And so I think I can tell you what not to do. Leora, do not schedule a hearing on Good Friday if you're trying to do regulations on sex, gender diverse students. But in the end, it's really important to get the voices. I was not raised Catholic, and so I totally inadvertently didn't respect that process, and it only helped, fortify the conspiracy theories. But I would say that fundamentally, try to listen to all sides. There is value, and there are authentic and valid concerns on all sides, and trying to find the middle ground by listening through to what people are trying to express that their words may be inadequate for, and find that common ground, and then you can work from there.
I think, Amber, I'll jump in too. I think one of the challenges is that oftentimes with competing priorities, there's a tendency to listen to or hear the voices who are the loudest the most. And that has some value and it has some risk. And so I think always thinking too about whose voices are you not hearing is really important in a process, and they're harder to seek. And it's yet upon us to take that time and to seek that information to get that full perspective that you were talking about too, and that that policymakers are busy. And so it is challenging to get the attention. It is best practice to use kind of the combination and to really understand what powerful data storytelling can be. And that helps. I mean, that helps because there's a lot that's coming at you at different points. And so being able to rely on data, but also question it to know like whose data is it? How was it collected? Who asked the questions? Was there an equity lens to how that data was analyzed or how the sense making was done for it is also important.
I'd like to offer another lens to the conversation about data that I think Rochelle really started to open up, because as we talk about policies, and I'm having this meta moment as I'm looking at this question, how do we design student, family, and educator-centered policy? But I think we really need to take a look at who are we doing the designing, and should we be doing it or should we be co-constructing? And I think that we should really be co-constructing these types of policies because they would answer some of our questions about data. And I just want to weave in an element of working with tribal nations and indigenous peoples that I think part of our responsibility, if we want to take the we as the people who are currently doing the policy work and maybe folks who are left out, really need to really have an opportunity. I'm not going to say that we really need to, but we really have an opportunity to use our voices and our platforms to ask the systems, what is this data for? And really to help honor and respect the rights and the sovereignty of tribal nations when they don't want to share the data with the US government, and really as their liaisons to reducing health disparities, it's our role to be their advocate and to help find another way. And one of my mentors is in the room, and she taught me, Rebecca taught me my most important lesson about government, but she didn't even realize she was teaching it to me, as all the best lessons are, that a no can always be revisited. And I really hold on to that, because what I discovered is that a lot of times in these policy situations, a no can be revisited because we're not even speaking the same language. So first figuring out if there's a little bit of cross-sector translation that needs to happen, and then we can revisit those no's, but also we can really understand where our sphere of influence is to implement what's being asked and to speak the truth to the system in a way that needs to hear it.
Yeah, I think, that just made me exhale bigly. I appreciate, Amber, you're shifting the language of co-designing to facilitating a process. And I'm cognizant of how many of us in the room have mandates. And I don't mean that mandates as in we don't authentically believe in it, but mandates to create school mental health referral pathways, for example. And how often inadvertently we might be creating systems of doing things for people rather than with folks, right? How often are we asking young people, what does it mean to be seen when you need help? And who do you want to be seen by? And what does that look like to be seen? And how does that then inform all of the policies, as Lisa was saying, that kind of like, instead of us defining first and then seeking consult, go into the source. And I think the piece that I'm in reflection about, Kendall and Rochelle, as we move into the next piece is also how do we do that partnership without tokenizing or manipulating young people, families, and community members that we work with, so that it doesn't just feel like a qualitative story and an ornament. And I mean that respectfully. It doesn't actually feel like they're an ornament, but they're actually partners with us. So wanting to just plant that as we move into the next piece, which is the center of this conversation. Y'all, how do we modify or dismantle policies that are in place that are injurious and not trauma informed? How do we use policy review as an opportunity for systemic apology or systemic reparation? And I'm curious, and it could even be like I have this policy that's in place, it's in the code, and I've wanted it to be gone for so long and I don't know how to do it. So just wanting to turn it first to Rochelle in your role at Denver Public Schools, and then Yasmina, but opening it to folks around like, how do we, instead of creating more, how might we actually examine what's in place and do some deleting?
That's a great question, Leora. And I think that I actually had an example of that just recently, as I am no longer on the school board, but I'm still a parent of a student that is in the district. And with COVID and the increase of anti-Asian hate attacks that are occurring across our nation, one thing that came up was the absence, just absence, but almost, leaving out of Asian American Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians in some of the school policies that had been recently developed for DPS. And it was just another bias and systemic racism really that has been happening in our system of thinking about Asian Americans as being model minorities and not needing the same kind of attention or supports as other students need. And so one thing that was great was there were a couple of students, again, going back to the students as the most powerful voices, I think, in the system, to go to a school board meeting, to testify and share what that impact was on them and what they would like to see and what their asks were, and having a board that listened and, rectified that and made a change and included and is moving forward to change the direction for the district to make sure that they're not being left out. I think that was a very traumatizing experience for many students to know that because they weren't listed, they did not matter. And that is not that is a example of omission that I think had to be fixed. And it was a powerful experience for these students, I think, to be able to go through that process.
I will say that for me, I know Amber said earlier that she could talk about policy until like forever. I could talk about changing old, like my jam is revoking old policy that's bad. And my favorite one that happened in Arizona was when the new superintendent of public education was elected. Arizona was one of 2 states that had on the books a law that banned mentioning homosexuality as anything other than a deviant lifestyle. And this is a really also good example of well-intentioned policy that was actually written by very progressive folks to implement AIDS and HIV prevention supports within our community, that in order to get passed, they had to make a bargain that inserted this language that prohibited us talking about sexual diversity in schools and providing health education. And so the first thing that happened when Superintendent Hoffman in Arizona was elected is an advocacy group sued the Department of Education for this policy, and she declined to defend it. And for me, it was just this, and that day I was still working in a high school, and our principal went outside and raised the rainbow flag in front of our school. And it was like kids in my support group were coming to me, and it was just like this beautiful, it was such a beautiful day, and all Superintendent Hoffman did was nothing. And so it's just so powerful that undoing old policy can have this massive change. And Arizona historically has taken children from their homes and put them into boarding schools against their will. They lose their culture. And so there's a lot of work to do if we collectively and thoughtfully and with community go through some of these old policies and get them off the books or amend them. And it will be better for us all.
Thank you for that. I'm just curious if there's other folks who want to chime in. I've got a question that's right here, but if there's anyone else who wants to chime in around what do we dismantle? How do we dismantle it? What courage does it take to do that?
Leora, I just want to maybe talk a little bit about the conversation you and I had about a week or so ago about an attendance policy. And dismantling that, right? And I am going to, just be totally honest with all of you. In my work as an outreach consultant at the elementary school level back in the mid 90s, right? One of my charge was actually to monitor attendance and to connect with students to see why they weren't attending and all that. And I drank that Kool-Aid. And so even though I was always advocating for the students, I was also, on the other hand, promoting like these perfect attendance prizes. And we had these convenings with the students, right? These assemblies where we were like, you have to be here 100% of the time, and you can, have your name thrown into the raffle, and at the end of the year you're going to win a bike or this or that, and rah be here every day. And I struggled with that so much, right? But I couldn't change anything. Now we know better, right? So we're doing better. We're still not where we need to be, but I think that it does take a lot of courage. It took a lot of conversations with my administrator and the superintendent of saying like, hey, if you're feeling sick, whether it's physically or emotionally, you can call in sick. Our students don't necessarily have that, right? We get a certain number of sick days per year. Our students, we don't offer them that same benefit. We're encouraging them, right? And we praise these kids that never get sick. But what about, and what about the preemies? What about those that suffer from asthma or have any other health issues? So they're just kind of out, it has taken a while, but I think that now society really is understanding globally what it means to push these students to be there 100% of the time. And so there are certain policies that are coming up, or at least, bill recommendations to consider and allow mental health to be like one of the excuses for absences. Now, personally, and not my professional hat, I'm taking my professional hat off, putting my personal one on, I don't agree with that. I'm glad that, that they want to add the category of mental health as an excusable absence. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think that I should have to, as a parent, divulge why my child is not going to school that day, whether it's physical health or, mental health. I don't feel like anybody needs to know, just like my boss doesn't need to know that I had a panic attack or that, my anxiety sort of paralyzed me today. I'm just going to call and say, I'm not feeling well. I don't need to give any other details, because with that comes a whole slew and a whole Pandora's box that is often opened, especially in smaller rural communities where everybody knows everybody. And these conversations will happen behind closed doors, or maybe not even behind closed doors, right? So that's just an example of a policy that needed to be dismantled. I think we're moving that way, but there's still so much work to do around that.
I think, Monica, what you're bringing up and servicing in conversation is again an inquiry point around how do we think about in designing, how do we create trauma-informed design processes to get to a trauma-informed policy that will then lead to trauma-informed implementation. Meaning, if we're all about, we're spending so much money and time and attention saying it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And I don't actually need to know what's happened to you. I just need to have the empathy and awareness that there's probably something going on. And meaning to know is more about me needing to control you. But then at a statewide level, we can then apply that to this policy inquiry work, right? So this came up in our earlier conversation, which is for all of us, it's how much are our policies focusing on the behavior and on the control versus focusing on the need, and how might we shift that? Worst transition sentence ever. Speaking of shifts, I want to shift to talking excuse me, that was very smooth. Okay. I want to shift to talking about the relationship between state systems and local systems, especially when we think about context, state system, state, local, and then school board. And we have representation from everyone in the House. Monica and Kendall, you've worked literally in the same state, same project in different roles. And I want us to talk about how do we grapple when designing or dismantling policies, the different needs of different levels of power. What are examples of what you would want to see and want to stop seeing? What hurts and what helps that relationship?
I'm over here so my fifth year, so it was only 1 year that I was on Project Calwell, and it was the final year of the grant. So it was year 5, and I was the third director. So Monica worked with one woman for 2 years, then one woman for 2 years. And then here's me, just out of grad school, hey, I'm here to run your guys' grant. My entire thing was doing anything that Monica and Hilva told me to do and writing the reports that they told me to write when they told me to write them, and sitting in on the SAMHSA phone calls when they told me to sit in on the SAMHSA phone calls, and sharing an Uber with Leora to the Sacramento City Sierra Health Foundation for the quarterly California Student Mental Health Policy Work Group. But I guess I say all of that to say that the most meaningful part was actually building those relationships. And it was hanging out with Monica and having lunch ordered in, and the Student Mental Health Policy Work Group, when we had to put together the folders because there wasn't anyone there to put together the folders, and those bonding experiences that really it's about finding the networks and the support. And I found that easy to do at the local vision and the district and the state when there is that shared vision. The shared vision, shared language, I think has been so important.
Leora, from the sort of state to the local level, right? And Nevada is not unique in being a local control state, right? Where I think you look across Arizona, Colorado, there's a lot of that throughout this call specifically, and then also certainly nationally. And I think there's wisdom in that because there is different levels of stewardship, I think, is the way that I think about it. And that allows for some contextualization at the local level that, at the state level, we just don't necessarily have a right to that insight, right? And we certainly don't have access to that insight when we're talking about, making decisions for students and families that, could be 400 miles away. And in Nevada, we have, I think, a really interesting spread, right? We've got the 5th largest school district in the country in Clark County with Las Vegas. And then we've got a school district that has sometimes 78 kids total in enrollment, right? So we go from, our urban districts, which have, 320,000 kids in Clark, to 64,000 or so in Washoe, down to truly rural and frontier districts. And so when we're trying to craft policy that can serve such a diverse spread of communities and access to services, we think about the HRSA shortage areas that exist within the state. In every single county in Nevada, school districts are geographically bound by county lines. Every single school district and county outside of Clark County is a HRSA shortage area. We have students that, you know, to get your kid to the orthodontist is a full day out for you, most likely, because it's you know, it's a 3-hour drive to the nearest orthodontist, and you know, the gas money to get there, all your other kids that are going to miss school, the ability to take work off, assuming you have insurance coverage and can make the co-payment, like all the barriers to physical and mental health services. And so how do we design policy that can be flexible, that sort of hits the most important pieces while allowing for some flexibility and contextualization at the local level? And that, I think, can really only be done in partnership with the people at the local level. And that might be like maybe beyond obvious, but I don't know that we always think about it in that way at the state, where we consider we have our charges, our mandates, as you talked about, Leora, where we're tasked with creating or implementing some policy that's either been given to us by the federal government or that our state electeds may have thought to put into place. And then how do we allow that flexibility so that it can be adapted to meet the needs of not only diverse sort of community populations, but diverse students and student and family constellations, right? And so I think my first thought when you pose that question was you have to listen to people. You need to ask them, and then you got to like listen to what they say. And so, and that's a really important piece that I think we often forget. That's why I go back to policy as a process. If you're going to get to something that's workable and good and as close to correct as possible, it's got to be through that collaborative process of give and take and listening.
Yeah, Amber, you're reminding me, I know that there are more folks chiming in. I just want to kind of give a concrete example. At the school that I taught at, there was a policy, a no hoodie policy, which again is a huge, yes, we can have a whole conversation about policing students' clothing and what that's actually a veil of. And if we are really, again, I remember thinking as a student teacher and having one student whose hoodie was a deep safety mechanism, deep neurodivergent, highly somatically sensitive, where amount of noises that activated that actually having a hoodie allowed that young person to focus and to feel safe. And then next to him was a young person whose brother had been killed due to gang violence, with a young person wearing a hoodie, and had a story about young people wearing hoodies. And I'm saying this only to paint the picture, not to tokenize or reduce, but only to paint the picture that in one classroom, there's two needs that are present. One for and one without. And that's actually the complexity of trauma-informed policy work, which is to say that nothing will ever be universal because our needs are not universal. And also there are some things that are universal at the same time. There are some things that are universal. So I'm raising that because there wasn't a right or a wrong, except that there wasn't a conversation. Ultimately, what it came down to is that policy was in place because the educators in the building felt unsafe seeing their students in hoodies, which is about the adult safety and not the student safety. So all that to say, Rochelle, I think you had something to add when we were talking about this complexity.
I think yours, Leora, so kind of highlighted that on a very personal level. My example was more at that kind of state local tension that Amber was mentioning earlier, where, during my tenure on the board, we were able to revise our school discipline policy to limit the suspensions and expulsions of the preschool to third grade students, right? That was happening, and it was happening more for brown and Black kids. And we couldn't continue that kind of school to prison pipeline that exists. And so it did pass. It was a grassroots effort, which was really exciting to see the origins of it. And the interesting thing was that there was a similar legislation effort at the state. It would have established similar suspension and expulsion limits statewide, but it died in our Senate committee, which was Republican controlled at the time. And I think that what happened, and this goes to process, I think too, was that a group of superintendents who were from rural districts banded together and like, this is not going to happen in our district. And it goes to that tension of like, how do you meet the needs of all of these different districts that, you know, for Denver as an urban district, we had a voter approved tax measure that gave us an extra $11 million to support children's mental health in schools. And so that also points to the complexity of the situation, which is the inequities that occur in our funding and the impact that has across our districts that allows certain districts to do things and others not, because of those different ways in which we fund the education of our children. There's so many disparities there that could be a whole other conversation.
Yeah, and will be continued because I know Yasmina's questions and I know the folks on the panels on Thursday will be continued when we talk about braided funding. Thank you. Okay. Oh yes, budget and value statements. Okay, so colleagues, we're at time to start to integrate. That's my facilitated way of saying close down. Okay, integrate. And I want to offer, it's the order in the chat box, I want to offer if there is one thing, takeaway, words of advice, sentence that you are offering for folks listening in, or that you would have told yourself, Rochelle as early school board member, Amber way back in early policy days, Monica at the beginning of your organizing of the California School Mental Health Policy Work Group, Yasmina, you know, you get the picture. What is the one thing, one takeaway, one words of wisdom that you'd like to offer folks? We're going to go Amber, Yasmina, Kendall, Monica, Rochelle.
That's such a good question, Leora. You always have the best questions, by the way. I feel like there should be a book of Leora's questions. You know, I think at the end of the day, you know, be humble. You know, no matter what you think you know and what you think you've learned, you got to be open to listening to other people and not assume that you have all the answers. And that comes with some humility, especially, you know, when you're put in a position of power, so to speak, right? And you're tasked with doing this, and there are expectations around that at some level. Sometimes we forget that it's not about us, right? I mean, sometimes it is, okay. But it's not about us. It's not. It's about the kids and families and the people that we serve and the educators that we serve. And so being able to, I think, put aside your, you know, any preconceived notions that you have about what the right solution might be, any ideas that you have about correctness or not correctness, trying to really critically examine your biases, no matter how difficult that might be. And I think that fundamentally that, for me, it probably, you know, best summarized in humility. And I think with that comes, if you're assuming humility, then you're also assuming an intent and a willingness to listen and to really listen, not just like, you know, listen and check boxes, but to really try to think about and ponder, take on and examine other perspectives, even if they're not comfortable, and connect. I think that allows us to connect on that human level, soul to soul, so that when we do the work, it has a better chance of meeting the needs of the humans we're supposed to be serving.
Thanks, Amber. Great. Nina, Kendall, Monica, Rochelle.
It's really interesting. My answer this time, I'm pretty sure, is totally different than my answer last time. So here's your plug to watch the recording. So I would say that the one thing that I would do this session would be and I'm going to make this specific to state level leaders, that if you want to make the change, you have to understand how the game is played. And so if you did nothing but spend your first year figuring out who are the decision makers and the gatekeepers, and it is almost never the person who has the title at the end of their name at the top of that department. And that probably works on a school campus too. Actually, that does work on a school campus. But when I say, but at the state level leadership, figuring out who is the person, especially when you talk about undoing bad policy, it's usually a matter of finding the person who has the original Word document from 1993, asking them to modify it, and then it happens. I swear it's that easy, and you don't want to believe me that it's that easy, but sometimes that's really the hardest part, is figuring out who can modify it and then doing it. 1993 was a great year. But we might need to make a few updates, Amber.
All right, I am reflecting on, what would I have told myself, 5 years ago? And I would have told myself, it's okay to be a rebel leader, and like, you will ruffle some feathers. I think coming into the field of mental health, it's such an emotionally charged phrase, just mental health. Everyone has so many feelings. You bring up the word mental health. At the beginning, our Board of Education was like, it's wellness. And we're like, okay, it's wellness. It's okay to ruffle some feathers. It's okay to say the word suicide in front of a classroom of students, in front of a classroom of teachers, in front of a room full of adults. And you might be unpopular at the end of the day, and not everyone is going to like it, but it's what's most effective, and it's kind of a necessary part of this work, I think.
I will just build on what you two have said. And I would tell my younger self, put your ego to the side, ruffle the feathers, stand your ground. It's put on your seatbelt, because it's going to be a bumpy road ahead. But after you've known who the key players are, after you have ruffled those feathers and the dust has settled, things are going to go the way that they're supposed to for students. And I did put something in the chat, and something that I've known for a while, but it's just recently, with some projects that I've been handling, resonated quite a bit. A no isn't always a downfall. I've been told no, and gone home disappointed and all that, and then really by the end of the project, I'm almost grateful. Well, no, not almost, but I am grateful for those no's, because all the relationships that were built along the way, and the way that whatever program or activity has flourished has been 1,000 times better than the way it was planned if I would have just been told yes. So put the egos to the side, accept the no's, embrace those yucky times, and move forward.
Thanks, Monica. So I was thinking back to an Uber driver's recommendation to me as I was going to the airport, back when we took those Ubers. And it was while I was deciding if I was going to do this school board thing. And he said to me, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much space. And I know somebody else said that, but I attribute it to him because it was timely. And I just think that that is so true, right? We all need to live on the edge. We need to be brave enough to tell our stories to the humans who make policies, because they are all human. They just don't happen. And so because we are all human, we will make mistakes. We will have celebrations, and we need to celebrate them too. So find your champion who will listen to your story, and live on the edge. I'll turn it back to you, Leora.
Yeah, I mean, I also feel like I just wanted to offer, because I know I'm looking at names who are in the room too, and folks who are listening, that every champion and every person living on the edge and every person willing to ruffle their feathers needs champions, and needs folks willing to live on the edge for them, and need folks to be able to be like, ooh, nice feather ruffling. Everyone needs that, especially when it comes to policy dismantling, because it's an incredibly, there are reasons that there are still policies in place from enslavement. There are reasons that there's still policies in place from what we think are relics from systemic oppression and systemic dehumanization. They're not gone for a reason. They're there because they serve. So the question is, how are they serving us? And what do we need to do in our own practice? I think part of the piece that I want to end on, many of you know Parker Palmer. I had the honor of learning with him many years ago. And he runs the Center for Courage and Renewal. I promise you this is connected to the reason and the way that we all started. But what he says is that there's this fallacy, right? That the personal is on one side of our work and the professional is on one side of the work, but actually that it really looks like this, right? It really looks all like this, that everything is always connected. Yasmina's in this work because of your grief experience. Monica, you're in this work because of what you're holding. I'm in this work because of people I have lost and people that, and that I have more space to stand up for. And so that, if there's any, for me, if we close on also anything for me adding into the choir of this incredible panel and incredible voices of teaching, it's that we can't silence our personal. Our personal is often our most powerful, and our personal is often where we get the most of our bias from. And so part of the invitation today and thinking about implementation is that policy, again, is not it's the algorithm under the thing. It's the ingredients that go into the thing. And so I'm so grateful for Yasmina and Kendall and Monica and Amber and Rochelle for your time. I'm grateful for Parker Palmer to teach us that we're all connected. I'm going to encourage you as we close today to put one takeaway out of all the golden nuggets you heard, one takeaway into the chat box, including our peer teachers, because that helps our brains integrate. There is so much coming at us all day long. Let's help our brains and our bodies out by identifying just one thing. Carrie will put the survey in the chat box. We'll send it also as a follow-up. That helps us program for the future. If you were like, I wanted to hear 75,000 hours about that, or I never wanted to hear about that again, please let us know. But of course, also most importantly, like Angela just did, I'm thankful for panelists for ruffling the feathers. Find a champion to support you in the work, and don't be afraid to flip a table or two. Angie, we didn't even say that, but I'm so into it. Throw the pen. Okay, great. Yes. Yes. Flip the table, especially if the table is dramatic. So please put your exit tickets. I want to massively underscore, bold, highlight, encourage you to come on Thursday. I think definitely saw Lisa in the space. I'm going to see if who else did I see who's going to be with us? Jen Baker will be on with us on Thursday. Kendall will be on with us. Lisa. Maybe some other folks too that I can't see because of all the windows. But please, please, please join Thursday for 2 powerful sessions on implementation. Carrie just put the registration in the chat. Hopefully you get the vibe. These are conversations. Amy's takeaway, Jen's takeaway. Policies are statements about who we are choosing to be and who we are serving. Bringing thought partners together. And another integration, budgets are fundamentally value statements. Have people who champion your ability to ruffle feathers. I feel like there's some sort of cartoon image coming up. There's just going to be something, the little yes. Okay, I'm taking a breath. I'm inviting everyone else to take a breath. I'm going to ask for Monica, Kendall, Amber, Rochelle, and Yasmina to stay on for about 5 minutes afterwards. As you leave, again, please offer us your takeaways. And I also wanted to offer everyone an invitation to thank Kendall and Yasmina, Rochelle, and Amber and Monica for being willing to learn in public. We're really grateful for you. All right. Thank you all.